Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Ellie Hain, an artist, researcher, and cultural strategist working on new imaginaries and ideologies for the post-industrial age. She's now working on a new social vision based on meaning and values, which I encountered through this video that Ellie put out called Exit the Void, which was really compelling. It's a little over a half an hour. And I think you did a STOA presentation on this as well. And there's a whole project that you're engaged in that you just launched called Rebuilding Meaning. And so I thought, this is, very, very germane. I also know that you are very active or have been very active in the Metamodern community. I don't know if you still would, use that word or whatnot. But yeah, I really wanted to dig into this and talk about this project that you're doing in this video and what it's all about. So anyway, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting. I was really looking forward to this podcast.
Awesome. So yeah, let's just kind of dive into this a bit. I mean, can you frame a little bit what it is how would you describe this work that you're doing? You say you're working on new imaginaries and ideologies, which I love because I'm very interested in, what I call civilizational design. People talk about culture architecture or ontological design, and it seems like you're kind of in that space. So tell me a little bit about what's the big framing for this sort of project?
Yeah, totally. That's a very good place to start. And it actually connects to what you were saying, that I've been active in the metamodern scene and if I'm still using that. So how I arrived to this work is I started with like Perspective and Emerge, and then kind of this like research project around social imaginaries. So I had always been very interested in kind of like what is like culture and like narrative and like the meta structure of society, especially because of like growing up in, first like super hyper religious, then kind of like seeing all these like very different contexts, the kind of like hyper capitalistic social careerism and so on. And so I started pursuing this question of like what is kind of like the narratives of society made of, and then kind of like the lenses that I was like looking for that was social imaginaries, especially kind of like taking from the concept of Charles Taylor, but also like Gerard Bouchard, these Quebecese philosophers. And this is kind of like mapping like the social imaginary. I think that people in the metamodernism scene kind of like know me from that like previous work of mine. And this was kind of like the first phase of this project that I was trying to like map out, okay, like where are we and like what's happening, like where are we going next? And I thought that Imaginaries was a better framework for approaching this question, because it's not just at the level of ideology, it's at the level of paradigm, right? So this is where you're trying to understand what are like I call them like master myths that like run society. Are we talking like the economy, nation states, but also something that you're trying to do with emergentism, which is not just the myths, but like the ontologies and epistemologies that really define a paradigm. In this case, like the modern paradigm. So then it became pretty clear to me that the modern paradigm was running out, and that something new was coming, and that new people already started talking about like metamodernism, and that's how I got into the scene. So I became kind of like really interested in this like shift, but maybe not very quickly, but like soon enough, I like realized that even though this like, super meta mapping is like very interesting, once you kind of like know the gist of what's going on, real change doesn't happen at the level of imaginary or at the level of paradigm, but it happens at the level of ideology. So it's like a lower step in like resolution is kind of like more detailed in this sense. So, modernism didn't emerge because people were like, oh, we're like modern individuals. We're like, no, we're kind of like liberals, right? Or we're kind of like communists or like socialists. So in the same way, like what are the metamodern ideologies that can like take us there? And I had been working with my really close friend and now co-founder, Joe Edelman, for about 3 years. We started also kind of this Imaginaries project together at the beginning. And he was kind of like tackling like the systems aspect of this new ideology, values and like values-based design, and kind of like an economic alternative, social alternative to like preferences and revealed preferences. And so I brought this more like sociological, mythical lens to that, and what did this mean? So we've been working on this for over 3 years and a half. And last year we kind of finally like, okay, we think we have something. And now it's time to spread the idea and to build. And we're like very, very early on the process. This is like a huge really complicated project, but it feels really good to start to get the word out.
Awesome. Yeah, that's all very helpful. And yeah, it seems like this was part of a pair of videos. So this Exit the Void came out at the same time that Joe's presentation on the kind of economic systemic integration of these ideas into like how could we rebuild the economy, along the lines of meaning and value rather than attention and profit and that sort of a thing. Which so I highly recommend that. I'll put a link in the description to Joe's video and all that. So you brought up a couple of things I find very interesting, actually, and I think that that's a very brilliant point that, like, these shifts in culture that have been paradigmatic shifts, like let's just say from traditionalism to modernity or modernity to postmodernity, they didn't come about by people being like, oh, we're going to be postmoderns now, or that was a higher level of abstraction that came out of the things themselves, and at a more ideological level, as you're saying now. And it's sort of interesting though, actually, because this has been very unique about something going on in metamodernism that I've identified, which is that it's sort of the first paradigm shift that has been self-conscious of itself as a paradigm shift, right? And so it's sort of like meta-aware in that sense. And I think in many ways it's very fascinating because almost consciously or intentionally, it's trying to frame itself as a paradigm shift in a way that cultural transitions haven't happened before. And I should also qualify that slightly. The cultural theorists like Vermeulen and von Daniker were doing much more of the sort of abstraction description stuff. But since that paradigm has been sort of articulated, it's sort of been run with in that way. But anyway, I just find that a very fascinating point because it's sort of like once you identify that, then it's like, okay, that's fine. But at the same time, this needs to translate into like a on the ground, like almost most ideological.
People,
yeah, go on.
Exactly. I say like most people want to take and they want a direction that they can believe in. And they say like, yeah, this is what we're doing. And it's not just a direction, but a direction that derives a certain set of actions, maybe even practices, right? And unless you have that, when you're just saying like, a modern is a sensibility, right? And there's many things that you could do. And even with that there can be many theories of what can be done, kind of like micro ideologies. But yeah, I believe part of the reason why I really believe in this project, and I think we have like a pretty powerful proposition, is that it's not just a vision, but it's like a very clear and like actionable approach on like how to transform in these institutions around this.
So what would be a better approach to this, do you think? Should we would you want to try to frame the whole project up front? I know you've already framed your work kind of in general, or would it be better to do that sort of big overview first, or to just kind of dive into this video and sort of unpack it?
It's a pretty big project. I don't want to like scare your viewers like
well, I don't know if you can.
I wouldn't scare them, but no, maybe I'll just say very quick.
Sure.
But one of the things that's already been running for a while is like we have a design school that like teaches people how to design for meaning. First, with like values articulacy, and this is useful for designers or community entrepreneurs, AI researchers. So that's kind of like one thing that has been running for a while. But then what we're another of our propositions is that we're like developing some like AI prototypes. And so we have kind of like part of the research in kind of like the alignment sphere, but then actually some like more like producty things that we will be releasing sometime this year. I can't say exactly when. And then there's this sort of advocacy, media, events, rituals parts that like the Exit the Void, I think it's kind of like the first myth that I'm trying to articulate of this like paradigm. But how I'm thinking of this is like there's like a set of myths that like build on top of each other. And with this is kind of, that's like my art project. When I say I'm an artist, like that's my sort of art. I'm trying to kind of, how I think of these is there's this like theory, like intellectual theory, but like there's an emotional resonance in each, what you say kind of like poeticizing and the realm of myth. And they all kind of like, is this like world building project. So that's kind of like the fundamental myth of it, that I'm trying to articulate like a different notion of what's good, which in my work in social imaginaries, that's how we orient society. And from that, a new narrative of the self, a new vision for the social order, blah, 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 blah.
Awesome.
But I'm kind of like really excited, but it's like good to remind myself that it's like step by step and it's and it will take a while.
No, clearly it's a very meaningful project, but it's very rich and there's a lot of layers to this, and it's clearly there's a lot going on. There's a lot theoretically going on, but I think what's exciting about it is you're doing exactly that, right? You're like, making it connect at the emotional and the aesthetic level. And so I'm interested to hear you frame it in that way, that sort of this exit the void is sort of the first myth in this sort of art project that you're putting out. So let's dive into that a little bit then. This exit the void video, which again I thought was really well done, very compelling, and is already getting a lot of traction. I think the sharing of that on the Stoa last count had well over 6,000 views, so it's getting out there. Let's set this up because this is all about meaning. I'm curious, there's been a little bit of debate recently about the meaning crisis, this phrase that's sort of been popularized by John Vervaeke and others. And some people are like, well, that's not a real thing and this and that. In this project to rebuild meaning, it sounds like a presumption of the project itself that our relationship with meaning is broken in some way. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, the cultural context for this rebuilding meaning project, and what do you make of an idea like the meaning crisis? Is that helpful or what?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and like answering these properly and in depth would like take me a long time and it's quite hard, so I'm gonna give you sort of like short answer overview. So there's two kind of like types of meaning, and depending on how you analyze it, there's like a meaning crisis or there's like not a meaning crisis. So in one sense, there's like not a meaning crisis because it just feels like, as a civilization, we're just kind of, we've been over our postmodern phase that was kind of like very adolescent. And now we're just kind of like growing up and being kind of like, okay, not adults. And like, what do we do with our lives? What we do with ourselves? And in this sense, there was meaning before, but it was a meaning that was perhaps like more the meaning that conservatives talk about when they say, oh, just like get married and have a house and, build a family, kind of like it was like very tied to like social norms. And that doesn't mean that the things that we did were like less meaningful, but maybe there was less of a kind of like conscious decision and like action over what was meaningful. So this is an aspect I could say like, there's not a meaning crisis. It's not that there was more meaning before. It's just that we're like in a different evolutionary cultural stage. Now, there's another sense in which there is a meaning crisis. And that's what maybe like Joe's video makes like a better point at addressing, or at least like with more like practical examples. That is also what I call like the proliferation of bullshit. And that is with, capitalism and like really scaling our systems. The social fabric is frayed. And kind of, like our, instead of kind of like face-to-face relationships, now we're like interacting with each other through like apps, and even kind of like self-improvement. Now it's not just about like cultivating wisdom, and obviously there's like spaces for it, there's a SOA, but like a lot of it is like, read this like list and like blink list, kind of, very automatized and kind of like devoid of the actual, or these influencers are like, I'm reading a book a week for like the rest of the month. Like, what are you reading, right? So in this sense, there's a meaning crisis as like bullshit has like proliferated. Maybe part of it's also because like now there's much more abundance of choice and of everything, and with that it does mean that like not all the choice is as meaningful and as good. But yeah. So I think kind of like the truth is like a mix of both of these. For me, I guess for me was what pulled me into this work was I was kind of like the bullshit resistance. I was like, I can't believe we're doing this. Like, I just personally can't buy it. So in this sense, for me, like it always felt kind of like very clear, and also kind of seeing how forcing ourselves to like participate in the system like kept infantilizing us, and like, so yeah.
Well, I'm curious too, to go in a slightly personal direction here, if you're willing to talk about this at all. You'd mentioned growing up, quote unquote, hyper religious. So I'm curious, did your own, did your own experience include anything like a meaning crisis as you transitioned away from a hyper religious background, or was it not such a break?
Yeah, not really, actually. Because for me, even my experience of religion being young never felt spiritual. Just felt very, this is what everyone around you does, and kind of like it was like very social norm heavy. That's like, it was like extremely Catholic, I'm originally from Spain, so this kind of a post-Franco dictatorship type thing. So I still did the thing, but it kind of like never took it as this thing that was like inherently meant to be meaningful. I think my kind of like my confrontation with the meaning crisis was actually the step that came after. So kind of first I was like raised very religious, and then kind of what people do after is just, oh, you go to like law school and you try to make a lot of money, and you kind of like buy into the traditional like modernist capitalist like narrative. And then I thought, like, for me, that what was really scary was seeing kind of, even when you win in this game, it's extremely miserable, right? So when you lose, it's miserable, and when you win, it's miserable.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is not okay,
Yeah.
like, why are we doing this to ourselves?
Yeah.
So that was kind of the real confrontation with like everything at every level is fucked up.
Yeah. I had a very potent experience of that. I was invited to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, their annual conference, which was really cool because on the one hand, there were like really big names there, like Don DeLillo and Meryl Streep, and Garrison Keillor gave the keynote and all this stuff. And it was really cool to like be around all these people. And yet it was also then really disturbing in the after party, because like I just saw people like be hounded, they're like, hey, read my manuscript and do this and that, and like they were like trying to claw their way to the top. They'd like push you out of the way to like talk to people, and then the people themselves at the top were miserable. Garrison Keillor was like, yeah, I'm gonna die soon, and nothing I've done has done any value. And I'm like, whoa, like what? So it was like that was a big wake-up call for me. I'm like, if this is the cream of the crop of like becoming a great artist in the system or whatever, it was sort of like, yeah. So that kind of actually affected my career choice of like what I wanted to do. So seeing people just who made it themselves being like, is this all there is, was interesting.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It just resonated.
So, now you named this dynamic, which is a big theme of this Exit the Void video, of the kind of distinction between social norms and containers versus the real experience of meaning, which it seems like you're referring to as the sacred, like you're using that term to refer to this sense of meaning, which you kind of define as the quality of connectedness, beauty, and meaning. That was a big takeaway for me of the framing for this, because it's sort of like, okay, well, meaning, what is that? So yeah, and let me see if I can tie this in real quick to that, and just to tie a bow around that meaning crisis issue, because I think I really like the way that you frame that. It seems like if we frame it too much as a meaning crisis, there's this image of like we had meaning and then we lost it, and now we've got to like get it back. Whereas I think I think you're right. It's a lot more of a sort of development process of like a lot of the meaning was very socially conditioned and sort of just, social norms. And there were these containers. And then we kind of grew out of that and became kind of self-aware that like that was going on. And then we were sort of in this middle period of like, well, what do we do now? Okay, I guess we make a lot of money, found that doesn't really do anything for us. So now we're actually, you could almost say, finally getting to meaning, right? Rather, it's like there's been this lack of meaning and now we're sort of finally finding it. And so, yeah, you make that distinction between social norms and containers and the sacred. So I don't even know where to start here, other than maybe like, could you talk a little bit about like the sacred? What does that mean in the way that you're using it, and how are you situating that?
Yeah. So, okay, big question. So the sacred is maybe kind of like, to give even kind of like a broader overview. Since I know kind of like you're also interested in investigating this question, what is God, right? So I personally believe in kind of like some sort of like Hegelian definition of like God as the infinite subject, right? And that is something that also kind of like new scientific paradigms seem to be kind of like confirming more and more. And so if it's like the experience, the subject also kind of like connected to like complexity science, that it just wants to kind of like develop and grow and experience itself. It's like the cosmos, the universe, the infinite subject wanting to experience itself. Then the way that it has to kind of like find out which are the paths in which I can grow and kind of like really grow in depth and complexity is not just what feels right or pleasurable or happy. Sometimes like suffering, is like a good like sensor for these, but what feels meaningful. So then in this sense, it is the experience of meaning that it's kind of like both the internal, like the felt sense, like the quality of meaning, but also kind of like the sense of agency that like leads you to like discover that and act on that later. So that, I think at the beginning of the video, I had something kind of like, I talk about all these sorts of meaning, and then I said something like, this is the universe of meaning expressed in all its creativity and range. But before I said something like, this is what most of religions called God, understood in all its creativity and range. So this is kind of how it wants to be expressed. And it's these are like process of kind of like discovery and enjoying and kind of like loving life in all its like essence and, you know, in all its like expansiveness.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's very well said.
Yeah.
And as you say that, yeah, I can see all the ways that framing it that way ties to, you know, the emergentism stuff that I'm doing, and a lot of the ways that people talk about a lot of this stuff in this space. I keep finding a lot of value in Layman Pascal's notion of like surplus cohesion or surplus integration, that when we feel meaningful, or even that sense of the sacred or the numinous, it's like it's that our spidey senses tingling, that like we're doing that thing that, like, as you might say, like that the infinite subject is, yeah. Well,
totally.
Well, let's, yeah, sorry, yeah, by all means, keep going.
No, and what I like about these is that in this sense, kind of like God or the sacred can be everywhere, right? So like you can find it in this conversation, or you can find it in kind of like super intimate, beautiful moments with your partners, but like you could even find it like in war, right? Sometimes people were saying like, oh, your videos like vary for like people who love life and kind of like hippie love. I'm like, no, you know, like even kind of like in a fight, or in, you know, like again, like in the rave, or in moments where we usually kind of conservatives, you know, meaning 1.0 would say like there's no meaning there, right? And this is like a much more like expansive take on you know what God and like the sacred is, that I think it's
yeah, that's actually really cool too, because it makes me kind of go back to even some of these earlier comparative religious formations or formulations of what the sacred is, right? And like I think of like Mircea Eliade talking about the sacred and the profane, which, you know, Durkheim also talks a lot about. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about that like the profane is the mundane. It's the social norms. It's when you feel just like you're doing the thing, you're going along, you're in the rat race. But the sacred is that thing that is specifically set apart as something other than that like feels special and feels like it has this kind of power to it because of that. So I like the way that kind of ties back in these other formulations, which is really cool. Speak a little bit about, if you want, if you will, the void, because as you said, this sort of video is kind of like the first kind of myth you're putting out, and so there are a couple images that are really kind of potent in this video, and the big one is the void. I mean, exit the void. So what is the void? I was trying to figure exactly what you were doing with that image, because oftentimes it's kind of a purely negative thing. It's like the abyss, but I also got a slight sense that like you were speaking about the void almost as like the very universe itself that can be seen as a dark place, but also can be seen full of color, you know. So I don't know, what is the image of the void representing?
Yeah, so the void, I use it as this like very multidimensional object. It's like my artistic license that I'm taking. And so in kind of like common discourse, the way that we understand the void is, first of all, as this kind of empty, scary, dark space. But then for example, like in Buddhism, in like Dzogchen Buddhism, when they talk about the void, they don't understand it as such. They understand the void as actually the opposite, is like super full, right? And there's no such thing as like empty space. Actually, we don't have like, also in physics, like there's no such thing as like pure nothingness or like empty space. So then for me, the void is not when there's nothing, but kind of when there's everything that we haven't like yet processed, or that we can't quite know, right? And so in the sense like the void is everything, but when it turns dark, it's when we feel to like disconnect with kind of like all the life that is there, right? And so for me, the void is actually sort of like a journey, and it's like this, you know, like very long thing that is actually like really colorful, beautiful, like full of life and like love and aliveness and you know, pure God. But then the more that we disconnect from that, the less vibrant it turns, the more gray it turns. And if we've been doing that for a long time, that's kind of like what most of us in the West like understand by the void. It's like really scary thing that like you don't want to look at it. It's like super dark, but that we know that if it gets like really close to you, you know, you can't quite avoid without going insane. So, and you know, psychonauts or like meditators or like people who have done a lot of therapy, they see that as the journey, right? Kind of like first it starts by being like really dark, and then it's like an arduous, like long, you know, dark night of the soul process, but eventually you get on the other side. And for me, the exit to void is actually not completely exit, but kind of like being able to like be in touch with the void like constantly, and like right now going on the other side and like being always in touch with that other side.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, yeah. So that is very rich. I mean, I also think about part of that like growth dialectic, you know, like the forward edge of God or the sacred, and that the growth edge, I guess is what you'd call it, right, is always trying to take in things that were like formerly outside of it or like alien to it or other to it, but somehow kind of integrate them in. And it seems like a big aspect of whatever you want to call it, metamodern spirituality, or whatever this kind of sense of meaning and purpose and religious kind of orientation that's emerging in this kind of new paradigm, seems to be very actively integrating that sense of the void into the sacred itself. And I find that a very fascinating and difficult project too. I mean, you also mentioned psychonauts, and I had the first kind of really bad psychedelic trip actually on some mushrooms some months ago, because I got a very big sense of like kind of like the everything bagel in everything everywhere all at once. It's sort of like, oh, this is like just, you know, this like lattice that goes everywhere, and it's very easy to feel like that's all just Maya and illusion and meaninglessness. But at the same time, it's also the context, that like the container for the possibility of everything to unfold. And it's very interesting for me to like experience that, is like seeing this sort of like, yeah, the abyss of everything, but to have it feel totally meaningless, to have it feel totally sapped of meaning. And I'd sort of experienced nihilism enough that I kind of was like, oh, okay, I know this feeling. This is familiar. So I think that, you know, I had enough kind of context to be able to be like, all right, I can deal with this. But it's very interesting to think about trying to go forward with our spiritual conceptions and our ideas of the sacred as somehow taking that in, but not having that kind of veer into nihilism, but somehow having it veer into this, wow, the infinite, you know, colorful tapestry of possibility or something. Those are just some thoughts. I don't know if you have any.
No, of course. I mean, really like staring at the void, there's like a reason why I said like if you stare too long, you know, like it will stare back, and there's monsters and like people go insane. You know, in our kind of like ordinary like way thinking reality, which is kind of like merely like scratch the surface, and there's much more out there, and there's a reason why people talk about it with this kind of like sense of like reverence, but also like terror. And yeah, it's approach with caution.
Well said. Gosh, I mean, my original thought was sort of like to just go through this video, but you're all the ideas that are kind of coming up from this conversation are like, there's so many really fascinating, you know, ways we could go. So maybe let's just try that for a minute, because people can watch this video, they can explore it. But I'd love to kind of dig into some of this. So let's see. Let me ask you this. I mean, what's the proper role then for social norms and containers in the sense of, in a couple of ways, right? On the one hand, it's not like we should just, you know, encourage everyone to like, hey, go check out the void, as you say, like there be monsters there, it's dangerous. So it always seems a need to kind of put a veil or some you know, some guardrails in. And in some ways, isn't that what traditions and social norms and containers do?
Yes, I guess kind of like making some, so like having, first of all, like having norms is different than having social norms. Having a set of like best practices and like community, you know, approaches to something that we all kind of like buy in and say like, yeah, you know, this is a good way of kind of like approaching like spirituality or like navigating family life or career, that are, you know, in many ways indebted to tradition. Like that's not bad. So practices and norms are not the same as social norms. Social norms is, you know, when like the community or like the social environment that is in like reifies a certain way of behaving as the way of behaving, the way that you're like supposed, and unless you do that, you're you're a pariah sort of thing. Now, not all social norms are bad, even in that context. So for example, like how to eat properly. I quite like, when people are polite when they're eating, right? And is this just kind of like something that makes like conviviality like easier? So that's fine. I guess a problem with social norms and kind of the thing with containers is not that they should like all go away. So for example, we have like a lot of social norms around, very easy example, like masculinity and femininity. This doesn't mean that they're all bad, or like I'm advocating for like completely letting go of them, but rather by recognizing the container that they're in. So maybe I feel like very feminine, but kind of like dressing in a certain way, or kind of like certain like careers is not how I, like doesn't really resonate with me. What I'm advocating is that by getting like really clear about like the aspects of like femininity that do resonate with me, so kind of, being clear on the values and their source of meaning, then I can approach the containers with both more spaciousness, as in like, I'm doing this and I might do this now because it feels good, but like knowing that I have the container rather than the container has me. And also it's the same by the way with like ideology. And this spaciousness also allows you to have like more intensity over it. So kind of like I can even, knowing that I'm not subject all the time to being a trad wife, I can even like LARP it even harder when I want to, because it's like fun. And it's this sort of kind of like role play that I have both with, more intensity and love and kind of like passion, but also knowing that, like this is not who I am, at least all the time.
Yeah. You gain greater autonomy to be able to move in and out of these different sorts of norms and roles when you recognize them rather than you sort of being them. And I don't know if you had any, if you were going to say something more about that.
And even I think, so like tradition, like there's a reason why we have it, right? And many of the social norms attached to the religion are connected to sources of meaning that are actually lindy, if you know, kind of like that expression, right? Like there's a reason why they have been, passed over the years, because like they're actually useful and they help you navigate life better. So it is possible that kind of like we'll end up in a place where we have like similar-ish lifestyles from the outside, but still kind of like the way that we interact with them, or like having the possibility to explore when some of these doesn't fit you, is still kind of like very valuable, right? Because if not, even I think also like connected to this like project of like cultural evolution, if you're only doing these because you've been told like that's the right way to do, even if that's where you'll eventually end up, it's good for you to like realize that that's where you want to be, because if not, you always end up in this like perpetual state of like adolescence. That's kind of like why plurality is that important, not necessarily because it's we all need to like live in these very different ways, but because we all need to have like the freedom to explore and decide what ultimately we want for ourselves as part of our evolutionary process.
So how would you relate, or would you relate all that we're talking about to like complexity and complexification? Because all this really resonates with me in the sense of, right, like, so complexity is in that sort of middle space between order and chaos, right? Like that's kind of where that happens. So you get there's like this image in my mind that's recurring of when you think of like a crystal or a mineral, right? It's highly ordered. So there's a lot of order there, but there's very minimal complexity because it's all basically just the same thing. And in my mind, I'm sort of linking that to like these social norms. They're sort of rigid and stuck. Yet, the void maybe in its entirety might be the chaos in some senses, right? And so it seems like what we're doing is sort of using what order exists to allow us to sort of bootstrap ourselves further and further into that void, and sort of bring in more of that kind of chaos, but sort of like make it more complex, if that makes sense.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it. I don't think I had thought about it this way, but it makes sense. How I've been used to thinking about these is that there's I believe there's an intelligence to life and the universe, right? This like theological kind of like growing into ever more and more complexity that we can tune in with what you were calling like the spidey sense, that is like by tuning into our own sense of meaning, right? That's kind of like what the compass that like sets the direction. And when we're like disconnected from that, whether it's because like very strong social norms, or because we're like only focused on like goals and the hustle because we're in survival mode because of trauma and we're not able to like feel our feelings. That's how all the complexity like becomes disordered. So yeah, I think kind of like tuning into that and kind of being able to like the social norms for what they're not is what allows us to kind of really participate in this process of complexifying and flourishing.
So this project is very much about kind of reimagining a kind of new social imaginary in that sense, and trying to affect culture in a positive way by reorienting, or maybe just orienting for the first time towards genuine meaning. So to that end, how does this get actualized, right? I mean, how do millions of people kind of grok what you're saying and find their way to doing this sort of engagement with the sacred, with connection, with beauty, with all of this. How do we institute this in a way that can be actually like really efficacious and can kind of scale in a society now that is incredibly complex and has millions of people? What are your thoughts about implementing this?
No, of course, that's the real work, right? So I think it is like useful to like make the distinction between the change that happens at like the mythical level, imaginal level, that just kind of like pure narrative, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like another layer that's like, it's still cultural, but it's kind of I call it like technosocial. It is more at the level of like policy and like mechanisms. And, like when we're talking about democracy, where we're voting and so on. So that's not just like a myth, right? It's not material in the sense like it's not biology, at least yet, but this is kind of like real systems and like complex structures that it's a big machine, and you have to kind of like operate. You have to be like technically skillful in order to operate. So here, our proposal is that right now, modern society is like built on preferences. So we see that, when we're like in nation states, we're voting, like a vote is a preference, and like it doesn't really like represent our values. It's like a very low resolution metric of what actually matters. But that's so far the best way we have to do it. And then in terms of markets, it's not just even preferences, it's like revealed preferences. So like whatever the observed behavior that they see, like it's the thing that goes, obviously absolutely terrible. And so here we're, our big innovation, the big innovation of this project is that with this kind of Joe's part, we've been able to kind of like really make a concrete metric out of meaning. So measure meaning and metricize it. We create these like values cards. And from these, just like so much possibility opens up. So we can train machine learning algorithms to be able to like elicit meaning from natural language, like data, maybe like through even your Twitter data, or from kind of like deliberation. Now there's kind of like several experiments in like deliberation, also using kind of like large language models and like eliciting values and meanings from that, kind of like Polis, this like Taiwan democratic experiment. So yeah, so that's kind of like, we're starting to kind of like create relevant research in that direction. One thing is having the solution, or kind of like a promising research direction. I think we're already there. Then there's like having the prototypes, making sure that they work. But the other thing is also kind of like shifting the meta structure. Because like right now, if you have to kind of like create these, the funding structure is not prepared for like these sort of projects. So you have to say like, okay, we need to be measured according to like these different, like sets of metrics, right? And you have to even kind of like nonprofit applications. They want you to have like a DEI, board member, and they want you to do exactly what they told you, because they will only give you funding for like, these very concrete projects. So it's like very complicated, and it's, happening at like many different layers. There's, even if you get that happening, that is like, okay, you put this out in the culture and like make sure that it doesn't fall prey to perverse incentives, that it doesn't get completely diluted so that it means nothing, right? This has happened with pretty much every ideology, and every time that, that they try to create social change. We're obviously like thinking about that and, mechanisms to prevent these from happening. I do think that since our main take that we're championing is around like being really concrete about meaning and making sure that we can measure it so that it doesn't dilute. We're in a slightly better position to approach this. But yeah, it's going to be like it's obviously like a very hard project, but I think it's worth trying.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it's like, I think you're right very much about that there's a narrative component and there's sort of an institutional component, and they seem to like naturally go together because they reinforce one another.
Yeah.
And so we need people changing the narratives through sort of new meta myths or new, kind of societal, meta memes, these frameworks for meaning making and sense making in the world needs to happen. And that's a big thing that's very exciting for me.
Yeah.
And I see this growing now increasingly, people kind of identifying the need for engaging mythos and that kind of narrative, imagistic level. But ultimately, yeah, that's got to be tied to these like institutional structures that can help kind of implement this. And on the one hand, it's almost this like impossibly daunting thing because all these pieces have to come together. On the other hand, it's like it is always been the process of how social evolution kind of unfolds.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's a system, and kind of like you have to like trust that like people will be picking up, they're like part of the project in a complex way, right? Like, so not doing these kind of like completely like top down, which then everything kind of like goes downfall. But yeah, and also kind of like connected to these, I think that at the individual level, anyone can always live up to their source of meaning and like create really meaningful lives. But then kind of like the health of a society is measured by like how easy does the systems make for most of people to live by that, right? And that's kind of like why at the level of implementation, now I'm kind of like, we're really looking at the systems aspects because that's what's going to like really shift the thing for everyone.
So, what would you say would be, I almost want to, this is probably something closer to end on, but I don't necessarily want to end the conversation here, but it follows naturally. But it's sort of like, what are the ways that people can actively get involved with this, whether that's specifically this project that you're working on, or if not that, but just more broadly? I mean, and that I think has two qualities. Like what can people do to assist this process, but also what do you think are some ways, maybe things you've seen that you can identify? It's like, no, that's definitely not helpful. How should we not, what are things we shouldn't do in this?
Yeah, so I think the most important number one thing is for people to like really tune in the spidey sense and like cultivate a sense of discernment, which is really hard. So what I see people getting close enough, kind of like, oh yeah, that's important. And then it kind of like feels good. And they do, like the easy part of the work, and kind of like they settle for something less rather than like going full stream to the thing that needs to be done, which is like much harder and like much more delayed reward and much more uncertain, right? So we've seen this happen in our circle with people, for example, getting early wins in raising awareness type things, or in being kind of like thought leaders, influencers, right? Like, I have a truth and it's actually true and it really resonates with people and people love hearing it. And then I'm just going this kind of like conference round, just like repeating the same thing over and over. And, this can feel very tempting, and it does have some impact, but then like ultimately, what is this translating into? And I think if people are like well tuned in with themselves, they will kind of find this out. And I think this is like a quality. It's not just spidey sense connected to meaning. And discernment is like a sense of like seriousness and commitment to kind of like really, figuring it out and like going all in. So connected to these, something that I've seen kind of like go wrong too, is that people are like very excited to, do the thing, to like belong to something, to kind of like find a thing that feels exciting, that like really builds us in a world. And then also, they're like not really discerning about what that is. So you find this, for example, very much in like Web3, for example, right? There seems to be energy and like, yes, we're going for that. Just kind of, I'm not saying that like everyone will be kind of like, the philosopher of tomorrow, and everyone needs to build these kind of like really comprehensive frameworks or like institutions, but just, kind of like being patient in these and kind of like being committed to the thing. I think it leads to places, even if it's like a slower path.
Yeah, I've definitely seen those dynamics for sure as well. And it's hard to know, you know, I think that like that's also a necessary component too, because like as you say, not everyone will be doing the thing, but just having more people excited about the thing is still
Yeah.
helpful. But it's sort of like also recognizing that if this is for this to unfold, people need to also do things rather than just sort of like,
Mhm. Yeah.
Another thing that I also see too is, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is sort of like, it's a very reflective community of folks that are very interested in these ideas. And so it kind of naturally tends to a certain high degree of auto critique. We're always
Mm.
kind of like picking ourselves apart, and there's some of that going on. And yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. I mean, like even just using terms, names, labels, whether that's metamodernism or anything
Yeah.
else, I find that it's very easy if you're a reflective person to be like, well, I don't want to be labeled, or
Mm.
this can be too cultish if we're all doing the same thing. But at the same time, there also seems to be something very self-defeating about that, of sort of like giving up on something we could be working on together. It's like, I feel like it's really easy to kind of acknowledge that labels are always imperfect and missing things and leaving things out and should be critiqued, but we kind of need them sometimes. I don't know
Yeah,
if you
of
have any
course.
thoughts.
And especially like labels for communities and kind of like a flag to, like run behind. I think this is like really important. And also kind of it's what makes people come together. I guess going back to the same thing, it also relates like the container versus the meaning,
Yeah.
and kind of like having these allows you to what I said. You can be super intense. Like I love many of the communities that I'm part of, while kind of knowing that like that's not just kind of that's not the end of everything, nor kind of like encompasses everything that I'm interested. But yeah.
Yeah. What do you think this looks like then? Like, what would a successful implementation look like in 5 years or 10 years? Like, what sorts of changes will we be seeing in the world to get a sense of like, oh yeah, like this is happening. We are seeing shifts in towards an economy of meaning. We are seeing
Mm.
shifts in our institutions. We are seeing shifts in the way that people are relating to themselves and the world. What does that look like? And what value do you think there is in having images and visions specifically of the world that we seek to inhabit in the
Yeah.
future? Like what? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with like the second question, the images, just because it's
Sure.
easier. I think they're like super important. And by images, I not just mean kind of like visual paintings or like photographs of like the utopia we want, but kind of like all the aesthetics, whether for some people it's like poetry or music or like any type of art, because that's what also like good philosophy and like good literature is able to do that. But like that's kind of like how we are able to relate to the vision, to the thing, from like an embodied way, rather from like this like purely like abstract. And when we're relating to this with this like kind of like deep full body sense, it's much easier to see when the thing is kind of like turning astray, than when it's not, right? I think that explains like a lot of the problems with like the effective altruisms, I think, for example. At the same time, it can also be dangerous. We've seen like the fascists. They were kind of like amazing, like power parades and kind of like the uniforms like very hot or whatever. But so yeah, that's why kind of like the opposite of beauty is not ugliness, because like ugliness points you to the thing that's missing, but rather the sense of like fake beauty, right? Again, I think this is something that like really requires like a lot of embodiment and kind of like being connected not just to yourself but kind of like to your context, to be able to distinguish between these two different types. So yeah, in this sense, images, myth, which is like conveying an idea from kind of like this like sense of like emotional resonance, poetics, any in that direction is super important. Then the second thing around like how what are the changes that we will start seeing. I mean, I hope it's a lot, and kind of like very diverse. So, and what I hope is that there's like different people, kind of like a lot of them, maybe they don't even know that what they're doing is like explicitly in this like meaning direction, but kind of like all these people, whether we're talking about like educators or like technologies or like very super like intellectual scenes, slowly like tuning into what they as a community find sacred and like really committing to like manifesting that into the world. There's been, we have like many examples from the School of Social Design, technologies and designers that kind of like, really fast kind of like change direction in their startup. From, for example, I can give you, just to give your audience a sense, there's been people that from a financial loaning platform, instead of making money from the loans themselves, they started to like creating contracts with like big employers like Walmart or Amazon for kind of like their low income workers, and they would make money from the employers rather than from the loans themselves. So that's kind of like a small change, but it just kind of like adds to this direction. Then there's many people working on education, many obviously like an area that's kind of like full of potential, but I can't quite know where it's going to lead, is like AI. We've seen in the past year how much change and how fast it's happening. We do have our like sci-fi story of how we would like this to evolve, but it's not quite happening in 5 years. I don't think so. I guess maybe kind of like what I want to say is I feel like at the level of there's a lot of possibility, and the bottleneck is not at the level of like technological capacity, but like at how fast can the culture assimilate all this change, and how well can it assimilate it. And I think this will like vary from context to context. And I can give you kind of like our more kind of like 10-year 20 vision, but like this 5-year vision is just like it will depend on how well people do the work in different communities.
One of the points I argue, and I think others do as well, is that if we do this, this sort of work right, if we do orient more towards meaning and value, that can help go a long way to fixing or resolving or healing the symptoms that we see, systemically playing out, and often more, frequently talked about, like with regards to climate change or, social inequality or things like that, systemic injustices of those sorts, that sort of nature. Is that something you would agree with as well? I mean, is this sort of an interior push towards orienting ourselves aright with meaning and value and the sacred, let's say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the opening premise of my video. I started talking about the void in the sense that like most people refer to it as either kind of the individual experience of like depression and like darkness, or the collective experience that we're like going through right now of like climate change and social inequality and just like everything essentially like going to shit. And it's funny because for me, even though I've always been kind of like very pro-social and like engaged with what was going on with the world, I never explicitly cared about like all these big like activistic problems. I mean, I obviously care, but like I never kind of like thought, this is the thing, because I was like, there's something more. And kind of like the thing that makes me really sad is kind of like this like trail of bullshit. I think in my video I say like, once we resign ourselves to not living by our sacred, things start turning gray. And once you resign yourself to grayness, it's just a matter of time before things get dark. So that's for me like the really scary thing. And I always see, behind all these like big problems, there's like a lot of source of meaning that like people really care, that we all care, but that we've been, we just kind of like given up on them. And this problem of like resignation at the individual level and the collective level, for me, that's the thing that has like, really broken my heart the most. And the thing that and it's also kind of like a really beautiful vision for like change, that is kind of like one that is like reconnect with the things that we love, right? And kind of like really commit to kind of like bring them into the world and into life. And that's how you solve all these big things, not with these kind of anger and gloom and doom and so on. That's kind of like the death cult paradigm. But rather like really reconnecting to the sacred and like bringing that into life.
Yeah, well said. Well, what other elements of this project do you want to name, or that we haven't talked about yet? Is there anything, there's so much to this that, it's hard to kind of know which parts to zoom in on and all that sort of thing. But is there something that we haven't touched on yet that you feel like is really important about what this is all about?
Maybe I'll kind of like end up saying something that is been like weaving through this for the whole thing, both kind of like the God and the sacred,
Mm.
and kind of like what should we do, that I think what's really powerful for me about sources of meaning and how they're like different from social norms and kind of like this new understanding of what God is that like we all have access to it, right? Like we don't need the, you know, external authority leaders. They can be guides, you know, that kind of like help us redirect the attention to the things that we find important. But like this is something that like everyone at any point can decide to tune in and like start acting on it right now. And if they pay attention to these, like these will like guide them throughout like their lives all the time, you know. So I think this is kind of one of the things that excites me most about this project.
I wanted to ask you about that too, because that was something that came up for me in all of this, which is and it ties back a lot into thinking about, well, what is the role of institutions and norms and social norms? How do we avoid a kind of continuation of the sort of fragmented pluralism that we're in? You know, like if there is this sense that like we've broken the grand narratives, it's fissured into micro narratives. And I think you do a great job in the video talking about how all that plays into this consumeristic kind of, you know, switch to preferences and people just wanting to do, you know, their own personal happiness. But I guess the question is sort of like, if everyone is just sort of listening to themselves, following their own meaning, is the future that we're headed towards more going to be kind of just individual localized pockets of meaning, or is there something more comprehensive, an integrated pluralism, a story or something that brings all that together in some way?
Yeah, no, of course. We've gotten this question before. I think it's a good question. Sometimes I talk about this is like reverting individualism. So kind of like the variant of individualism that we have right now is not really individualism in the sense that kind of like is not about like you like truly expressing your like, you know, deepest, most cherished values, but it's kind of like you alone playing in the system to kind of like satisfy your image in terms of like social norms and preferences, right? So I'm like reversing this. You are kind of like really, you know, meant to kind of like get in touch with your values and like live by them, but you're playing with others. So is this sort of, you know, like collective, social group engagement. Also because actually most people's values, like we are social creatures. And then of course, like the things that we find meaningful are more often, you know, being with others, or if they're not about being with others, they're like magnified when we're in the presence of others. So we've actually been, you know, we have like a small community in Berlin of like people who are like adjacent to these, and we've been doing this for like 3 years. And the changes that we've seen, they've been kind of like pretty much the opposite. Like there's much more community, the social fabric like gets much stronger. Also because values, they're actually well-revealed preferences, or like preferences, they can be like so many, because like, oh, I like this type of clothes, or this like particular aesthetic, or this particular type of music. There's not as many sources of meaning, which is a good thing, right? Like the things that we find meaningful is like a smaller subset, and usually they tend to be kind of like quite pro-social. So yeah, I don't think this will end up in, and for what we've seen already in our community, this just kind of makes the social fabric stronger. Even when people have like different values, when they're able to kind of like see each other and like, oh, this is why you care about that. So we've seen, we have in our community, we have some people who are kind of like values driven, but like very on the social justice side, and then some people who are like more on the trad side. And this could create like all these clashes, but actually I've seen kind of like values driven conversations around these. Oh, this is why I care about these. This is why it feels so precious. Like, oh, and this is why I care about this. This is why it feels so precious. And it works really beautifully.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Even our core team of the movement, we have Ben, who's a teacher of the school, who's like an Orthodox Jew, living in Israel. So we haven't I haven't even met him in person yet. We have Lily, who just joined, who's also kind of like during the social justice sphere. We have Joe, who is originally from like Silicon Valley, like American startup boy, and me, and maybe kind of like slightly more on the trad side too. So yeah, it's a fun bunch.
Cool. Well, how do people learn more about this, get involved, or
Yes, we have a website, rebuildingmeaning.org. We also have a Discord. You can join the Discord via the website. We are still very on the early days, so we're just kind of like preparing all that stuff. We will have more information soon. You can like leave your email there. You can join our Discord, and yeah, in the coming months we'll be announcing what are we going to do. We're going to do some events online and offline, and we're going to launch our AI prototypes. So yeah,
awesome.
Stay tuned.
Cool. Yeah. Well, and keep me posted with any of that stuff, and I'll make sure to put it out there, and maybe we can do another conversation down the line about when after some of that drops and whatnot. But this is really it's a very exciting project, and I'm really encouraged. I feel hopeful, which is really wonderful. And I see you being one of those people who is both excited about these ideas, but then doing that implementation stage in a really important way. So thank you for that. And thank you, Ellie Hain. I really appreciate you taking the time. This was really enjoyable. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a great conversation.
All right, take care.
Okay.